The mountains do not speak. They only wait. In the high, jagged reaches of the Montana wilderness, there is a silence so heavy it feels like it could crush the lungs right out of a man's chest. It is a place where the air is thin and the shadows have a way of stretching longer than the sun should allow. For those who venture into the deep woods, the trees are not just timber. They are watchers. The crazy mountains earn their name with every jagged peak and every sudden, soul-chilling gust of wind. It is a landscape of granite and ancient pine, a place where the map seems to lose its meaning the moment you step off the trail. In late September of 2014, the air was already turning sharp with the promise of winter. The ground was a carpet of dry needles and brittle frost, crunching under the weight of heavy boots. A man moved through this landscape with the confidence of someone who had survived it many times before. He was a hunter, seasoned and strong, carrying the gear that should have been his lifeline. He wore an olive-green jacket that blended into the brush, his eyes scanning the ridgeline for the flicker of an elk. He was not a novice, not a city dweller playing at survival. He was a part of these mountains, but the mountains have a way of reclaiming their own. On that final morning near Sunlight Lake, the world felt different. The birds had stopped their chatter, and the wind had died down to an eerie, breathless hush. He stood with his companions, men he trusted with his life, and made a decision that would haunt the records of the local sheriff for years. He decided to take a different route, a short trek to a supply cache where more gear waited for them. It was supposed to be a simple journey of a few miles. He should have been back by nightfall, warming his hands by a fire and sharing stories of the hunt. But as he turned his back on his friends, the forest seemed to close in behind him. The trail he expected to find was not where the compass said it should be. The trees looked different from this angle, their bark gray and peeling like the skin of something long dead. The sky began to bruise with the color of an approaching storm. Gray clouds tumbled over the peaks, thick and heavy with the weight of unfallen snow. He checked his map, his fingers tracing the lines of the topography. But the land beneath his feet refused to match the paper in his hands. It was as if the mountain had shifted its bones while he wasn't looking. The first flakes of snow began to fall, drifting down like cold, white ash. They were beautiful at first, but soon they were a blinding veil that erased the horizon. He called out, his voice swallowed instantly by the vast, hungry atmosphere of the peaks. There was no echo, only the sound of his own pulse thudding in his ears. By the time the sun began to dip below the western ridge, the temperature had plummeted. The cold was not just a sensation, it was an intruder, slipping under his layers and biting at his skin. He found himself walking faster, his breath coming in ragged gasps that clouded the air in front of him. He was no longer hunting. He was being hunted by the cold. Back at the camp, his friends waited. They watched the clock as it ticked past 6 o'clock in the evening. Then 7. Then 8. The fire crackled, but the warmth did not reach their hearts as the realization set in that their partner was not coming back. They shouted into the darkness, their voices lost to the wind that was now screaming through the pines at 50 miles per hour. When the sun finally rose on the first morning of the search, the world was buried in a foot of fresh, powdery snow. It was a blank canvas, devoid of tracks or signs of life. The search and rescue teams arrived with their radios and their dogs, their faces set in grim lines of determination. They knew the statistics for a man lost in a Montana blizzard, and the numbers were not in his favor. Helicopters beat the air above the peaks, their thermal cameras scanning the white expanse for a heat signature that wasn't there. The pilots looked down on a world that appeared peaceful from above, but they knew the tree line held secrets that no camera could pierce. Below them, the searchers struggled through drifts that reached their waists, their boots heavy with the weight of frozen mud. Days turned into a week, and the hope that usually fuels a search began to sour into a quiet, desperate grief. They found nothing. No dropped glove, no broken branch, no sign that a human being had ever passed through the drainage. It was as if he had simply stepped off the face of the earth. The mountains had swallowed him whole, leaving only the wind to whistle through the empty spaces. Then, the first piece of the puzzle was found. and the case of this missing 411 disappearance took a turn into the truly bizarre, miles away from where he was last seen, in a direction that required crossing impossible terrain. A searcher spotted something dark against the snow. It was his hunting bow, leaning against a tree as if it had been placed there with care. And nearby, sitting in the open, were his boots. The searchers stood in stunned silence, looking at the heavy leather boots. There were no tracks leading to them, and no tracks leading away. To be in this wilderness without boots in the middle of a sub-zero snowstorm was a death sentence. Why would an experienced hunter remove the only thing protecting his feet from the frostbite that was surely clawing at him? The mystery only deepened when they realized the distance he had traveled. To reach that spot, he would have had to climb over ridges that challenged even the most elite climbers. He would have had to move through the night, blind and freezing. Yet he had arrived at this specific tree. It was as if he were being led by a light that only he could see, or driven by a fear that made the impossible a necessity. The search continued for weeks, but the snow grew deeper, and the mountains became impassable. The case went cold, filed away in the cabinets of the sheriff's office. Another name added to the list of those the crazies had claimed. But the mountains were not finished giving up their secrets just yet. A year later, a rancher was checking his fences miles away on the other side of the range. In a small cluster of trees near a high mountain creek, the rancher found a backpack. It was weathered and faded by the sun, but inside were the personal items of the missing hunter. His identification, his electronics, his very life packed into a nylon bag. And next to the bag was something that chilled the rancher to his core. There was a small circle of stones, arranged carefully to form a fire pit. Inside the pit were small pieces of wood, stacked perfectly as if ready to be lit. But when the investigators arrived, they found that not a single match had been struck. There was no char, no ash, no sign that a fire had ever burned. The man had prepared for warmth, but he had never reached for the spark. Why would a man who was dying of hypothermia build a fire pit and then simply sit beside it in the dark? The logic of the situation had shattered, replaced by something far more sinister. It was as if his mind had been clouded, his instincts inverted by some force that defied explanation. Some call it the Oz effect, a moment where the natural world becomes a stage play, and the rules of survival no longer apply. 2 years after he first vanished into the pines, the final piece of the tragedy was discovered. His remains were found on a steep, rocky slope, far above the ranch where his bag had been located. He was miles from his boots, miles from his bow, and miles from the camp where his friends had last seen him. He was scattered across the granite, a grim testament to the power of the elements. But even in death, the questions remained. The medical examiner could find no evidence of animal predation. No tooth marks on the bone. No signs of a struggle. It was as if he had simply laid down and allowed the mountain to take him. His clothing was found nearby. Some of it folded. Some of it cast aside in a way that suggested the final, frantic stages of paradoxical undressing. But paradoxical undressing usually happens in the immediate vicinity of the body. In this case, his gear was spread across an area of nearly 10 miles. To move that distance in socks, through the jagged rocks and the deep snow, would have required a level of endurance that borders on the supernatural. It was as if the space between the peaks had been compressed, allowing him to walk leagues in a single step. There are those who whisper of things in the crazy mountains that do not appear on any biological survey. They speak of the Glimmerman, a presence that moves through the trees like a ripple in water, invisible to the eye but heavy on the soul. It is a predator that does not hunt for meat, but for the very essence of a person, leaving them wandering in a daze until the mountain claims the shell. Perhaps he saw something in the snow that day, something that didn't belong in our world. Perhaps he followed a voice that sounded like a friend, only to find himself standing in the middle of a frozen wasteland with no way back. The high peaks of Montana are full of these pockets of high strangeness, where the veil between what we know and what we fear is dangerously thin. This case bears a striking and haunting resemblance to the disappearance of Jared Atadero in the Rocky Mountains. Jared was just a child when he vanished, only for his clothing to be found years later in a location that was deemed impossible for a small boy to reach. Both cases involved the strange displacement of clothing and the eerie silence of the surrounding woods. When you walk into the mountains, you are entering a kingdom that does not recognize your laws. You are a guest in a house that has stood for millions of years, and the owner is not always a gracious host. The story of the hunter in the crazy mountains is a reminder that we are only ever one wrong turn away from the edge of the map. The wind still blows over Sunlight Lake, and the snow still falls on the granite peaks of Montana. If you listen closely, you might hear a voice calling out from the tree line. But do not be fooled. It is only the mountain, waiting for its next visitor. Stay on the trail. Keep your gear close. And never, ever look back into the shadows. The files remain open, but the answers are buried under layers of ice and time. We may never know what truly happened during those final hours in the snow. All we have are the fragments left behind. The boots, the bow, and the silence. The missing 411 continues to grow. A ledger of the lost that defies our understanding of the world. Be careful out there. The woods are deeper than you think. And sometimes, the thing you are hunting is the very thing that has already found you. The mountains do not speak in a language of words, but in the crushing weight of their permanence. When the search teams finally recovered the last of the hunter's remains from that inaccessible granite ledge, they discovered one final anomaly that never made it into the official county press release. Tucked deep inside the pocket of his discarded olive jacket was a small digital voice recorder. The casing was cracked from the sub-zero expansion, and the electronics were ravaged by moisture. But forensic technicians managed to salvage a single 6-second audio clip. In those 6 seconds, there was no cry for help. There was no screaming wind. There was only the sound of the hunter's own ragged, terrified breathing, overlaid by something impossible. The rhythmic, metallic clicking of something walking on the stone nearby. And then, a voice soft, melodic, and chillingly familiar repeated the hunter's own previous sob back to him with perfect, soulless intonation. "I'm almost home." It wasn't a human voice. It was a mimicry, a biological recording played back in a world where the laws of physics had checked out for the night. Today, those who brave the heights near Sunlight Lake still report sightings that defy explanation. They speak of a figure in a weathered green jacket standing on ridges so steep that even mountain goats find no purchase. When viewed through a long lens, the figure remains motionless, eyes fixed on a horizon that isn't there. And when the mist rolls in and clears a moment later, the ledge is as empty as a tomb. A map can show you the way home, but it cannot protect you from a landscape that has been hunting since the dawn of time. If you find yourself in the deep pines and the birds suddenly fall silent, if the shadows begin to stretch toward you even as the sun stands high, or if the air grows so heavy it tastes like copper, do not stop to check your compass. Do not stop to tighten your boots. Run, because in that moment, the mountains are no longer just watching you. They are learning your voice, preparing to echo it back to the next traveler who wanders off the trail and into the ledger of the lost. The files remain open. The search goes on. And the silence. The silence is hungry.